from the ground up, from the inside out. Before getting into the lecture proper, I'm just going to do a bit of a detour, a prologue, which I hope will in some way explain the title of the lecture. It's one of those sad stories of a competition lost, which most of you are probably familiar with. In this case, the competition was for a new master plan for University College Dublin, and for us this was really important because this is the university in which we've been involved for more than 40 years as students, as tutors, and now as professors. And the competition was to design a master plan to completely reconfigure the campus, doubling the amount of accommodation, reorganizing all the traffic and the new spaces in the campus, and very particularly to design a new building for the School of Architecture and Engineering within that new master plan. And for us, it was a kind of opportunity of a lifetime to think about our own campus and our own school. And particularly, we were the only Irish architects on an international shortlist, so we really felt we were playing for the home team, and we had to go for this one. So we assembled an international team, including our colleagues Allies and Morrison, and Max Fordham's, and Hargreaves Landscape from New York, and many others. And together, we really went for this competition. We carried out very extensive analysis of the existing campus, its geometries, its history, its buildings, its landscapes. And having done that analysis, we came up with a first move, which was to make a big sloping promenade, which went from the existing heart of the campus down to the entrance bridge. And using the campus geometries, then we widened that promenade to make a big bow-shaped space, the front square of UCD and the site for the School of Architecture, which the brief specifically said had to be a landmark visible from the road and from the city. So this is our new School of Architecture in this newly configured entrance with a new timber bridge and other structures. And we made a master plan which was really about urbanization. We were turning the campus into a little town. And to do this, we built on the footprints and the landscapes associated with 3 quite fine historic houses within the campus. And these became the centers for new neighborhoods around which we built all the accommodation and developed ideas about phasing and strategy. And we used our new urbanization to tie up the kind of ragged edges of the old 1970s campus, which somehow didn't have a proper form. And also on our team, 2 young practices who we invited in, which were Plattenbau and Superposition, who are graduates of UCD School of Architecture, indeed students of ours, now making names for themselves in Hong Kong and Berlin. And we asked them to look at the whole master plan and to think about a kind of other layer of architectural infrastructure of bridges and walkways and links and pavilions to provide a sort of second, more intimate way of moving around this campus that was based more on a pedestrian-human interaction rather than on big infrastructure. And we used water. There's a lot of existing hidden waterways, and we dug some of those up and proposed, for example, where the beautiful walled garden has been cut by a road in the campus. We reinstated the walled garden using water, and we used that historic moment as a center for a new academic cluster. And by building up, by really densifying and building high buildings in the campus, we had this feeling that existing beautiful historic gardens and the woodlands would be allowed to play a better role in the campus than they are at the moment in a kind of scattered, unorganized layout. Superposition and Plattenbau designed a beautiful little pavilion, cafe, performance space in the corner of that water garden. And the whole master plan make this newly urbanized world facing out over the Irish Sea with the School of Architecture rising out of its center, but also kind of dug into the landscape of the new promenade that we're proposing. And the building is designed to be seen from all sides, and indeed is approached from a number of directions, which works with the slope on the site. So it's composed of a concrete base with a big entrance ramp, public service facilities like foyer, cafe, opening into the big workyard. In the middle, all the studios and laboratories, and then on the top, hovering above the roof garden, a new research center and library. And the idea was that the cores are the structure. We were thinking about a School of Architecture being like a sort of demonstration to students of the amazing capacities of contemporary concrete construction to make big cantilevers and for the cores to hold up the building. So it's a kind of self-evident structure. And then it's also dug into the ground, as I said. And at the bottom, we have the landscape ramp, the courtyards, the workshops, the fab labs, all the things that you need in contemporary schools of architecture. And the foyer space is a place of learning, of debate, of discussion, of making, and also a place where installations and experiments can be exhibited. And in this drawing, we've shown Neil McLaughlin's installation from Ireland's Pavilion in Venice in 2016. The studios would open out onto these mid-level roof gardens, so they're kind of indoor-outdoor studios, and all parts of the building have a view out over the RSC and the campus. It's an interactive section, a section where there are big voids between the studio spaces, so everything is connected. They open into gardens, and then above everything is the research center and the lecture theater. So it's a kind of it's a building in a kind of asymmetrical equilibrium, a glass and concrete building hovering in the campus with the work of the studios on view from everywhere. It's a building that will be translucent, transparent in the daytime, translucent at night, a kind of lit up beacon in the heart of the campus. Or that was what we thought. But then we got the assessor's report on the competition, and it was very short. And the main point in relation to our non-winning entry was, your building is not a landmark. So we thought, okay, we thought actually it was a landmark. But further feedback came, verbal feedback, where we were told that they were really looking for a building that was designed from the outside in, and we had made a big mistake of designing our building from the inside out. So we thought, actually, you're right, we did, and that's what we meant to do, and that's what we always mean to do. So we decided then to call this lecture From the Ground Up, From the Inside Out. I'm just going to read a short text explaining that concept. When we speak about the ground, we mean the entire territory of the project, the given ground from which ideas emerge, the place, the people, the culture, the site, the wider context. These are the conditions that form the question to be answered in the architectural project. A good building begins with some inner order, often with the embodiment of a social idea. The architectural design evolves from the inside out, growing into form like an organism, an operative mechanism ready for work. Its formal composition results from the arrangement of working parts. An inside is a more complex term than simple interior containment. It means being at the heart of something, in the know. It's about understanding client intentions, combining the spirit of the enterprise with the useful life of the building. It means living the project, getting it under your skin, and then translating it, working it out in the design. So, a project that we completed in 2007, a house on the outskirts of Dublin, which we call the Sleeping Giant, is probably a very clear embodiment of our idea of designing from the ground up. It's on a sprawling, very three-dimensional site down below a road with a lot of rocky outcrops, a distant view of the sea, and a very strong presence of these granite rocks. So we designed the house in a kind of conversation with the landscape, making the house itself, in a way, a kind of outcrop that relates to the granite on the site. And we started, both of us working together, John making this sketch, something that is like a cross between a plan and a description of the brief. And this is where the Sleeping Giant name came from. So John made this drawing of a kind of big, lazy giant slumbering, sprawled out over the site with 3 legs, because there were 3 little girls in the family, the stomach, the breast, the brain looking out towards the sea, and the sun shining onto his lazy back. And at the same time, I was making a series of sketches of the rocks on the landscape. And in a way, these started as observations, a kind of close noticing, and then they gradually realized that they were not really an actual description of the site. They were a kind of interpretation of how we might build on the site. And then we worked a lot in model, because it's such a strong three-dimensional context. And in a way, we felt here we were experimenting, for us, with a new way of thinking about space and movement that grew up out of the idea of this very three-dimensional topography. And we proposed a concrete roof, which is like a big canopy of chamfered, canted concrete shapes. It's a kind of cross between a cave and a tent hovering over this house. And the site, the plan of the house, in a way, wraps itself around the one flat area, the kind of lawn in the middle, and then wraps its way around to look at the sea and to come back towards the road. And the rooms then, we were trying to think about a kind of intuitive way. In the middle, there's a fireplace and a stairs, which is the concrete structure around which the roofs are supported. And then they're held up on little columns. And then around that, the rooms open out and make their way out to the views and to the rocky outcrop and to usable spaces, sort of rotating around that center. And we were very interested in the idea of bringing the landscape in and the house out. So as well as being from the ground up, it's definitely also a house that's designed from the inside out. And because the road is so much higher than the house, the roof and the form of the roof was really important. And the sense of the whole house as this kind of built landscape was something that was very much on our minds. And a year or two later, we won the competition to do the Student Centre for the LSE here in London. And probably the work we had done in that house was a kind of research into a different way of thinking than we had employed before. In this case, the site was flat, but very compressed and very tight, and with a triangular geometry and a lot of narrow streets coming down, and the brief was complex with lots of different uses. And we wanted to make a building which had a kind of singularity that felt like one thing. For reasons to do with rights to light and other pressures, we had to make the building narrower at the top than at the bottom. So instead of stepping it, we sloped and canted it to make it feel like a big house for students, a kind of mountain of brick in the middle of London. And it rises above the surrounding streets as this clearly identifiable object. And at the time of the competition, we were already thinking about brick. And I made these studies thinking about sometimes the brick is solid, but sometimes it's pulled apart and perforated to let light through, because there are spaces in the building like the prayer center or the gym that don't really want people looking in. And so our work really became about making this, what we called a brick mountain, a big solid brick building, but which is not really solid because it lets light through. And in developing that over the following years, we had to draw and design the geometry of every brick. And there were over 100 special bricks, and all of them were drawn in 3 dimensions. But the thing about these bricks, they're handmade bricks, and each brick is cast in a wooden mold anyway. So to make a different shaped brick, it just means making a different shaped wooden mold. And while we were in the process of developing the detailed design, we brought the project as part of our installation to the 2012 Biennale in Venice. And we used it as a way of exploring more the development of the geometry of the brickwork, but also thinking about solid and void and form and space and movement. And anyway, Venice had always been in our minds in the beginning of this project. When we were making the first sketch plans, we had a really strong memory of this space outside the Pensione Accademia in Venice, which has an amazing sense of these red buildings converging. And in fact, they sort of feel like they're moving past each other. We know that they're not moving, but we sort of feel that the spatial dynamic between them suggests that. And we were trying in the LSE project to bring some of that sense of movement, because the site had all these little lanes that converge, and the students are moving from all of these other parts of the campus into their student center. So we thought about the shape of the building really being a response to the forces at work on the site. So where the lane comes up, the building pulls back to make a covered outdoor space where students can gather before going in. And then the staircase, because the site is so small, the stairs is like a public lane, like a route that moves up through the building, passing windows that look out to courtyards, doubling back on itself, sometimes overlooking all of the spaces, wrapping around the lift shaft, which is like a kind of stake, a totem pole in the middle of the building, sometimes looking back out to the street under the canopy. And when we designed the building in the competition, because of the site being so confined, we designed the building really as a series of perspectives, because it's always seen through narrow streets. And in this case, framing the new canopy, which we were proposing, which is built in steel and in timber and glass. And then we were asked to make the landscape outside. So The building comes from the inside out. We made a new street with street furniture. And the complexity of the brief can be seen in this section where it's got a disco club down in the basement, and we brought daylight and views down from the street and down from the back. And then there's a series of very varied and different accommodation going all the way up through the building. And the idea of the perforated brick and the big windows was that at night, the building would be a kind of on display to the world around. It would be a kind of lantern displaying the life of the student body within.
Yeah, as Ellis said, we're 30 years in practice, and for 20 of those years we've been building at University College Cork. Maybe for 25 of those years we've been designing at University College Cork. So tonight we thought we might just show you some of the new work that's on site there, and we might relate it to some of the work we've done there. With regard to the theme that Sheila has outlined, we'll try and keep to the topic of ground up, inside out. What a site. You see, there are 3 buildings in a row. I just want to talk about if you can call a bridge a building. But the real thing is that the cliff, the limestone cliff that the old university stands on, the cliff runs in a sweep around a bend in the river. So we have 1, 2, 3, and in a way those buildings are thought of as part of the configuration of that landscape sweep. And we started on the lower ground, down by the river, on the imprint of what you can see there as a former tennis court. And we've moved along to bridge the river, and now we're building on the other side of the quadrangle. But the character of this site in the university is such a strongly riverine, hidden world kind of character, because the topography is so strong and the rocks are so exposed and the trees are so lofty. So the first building we made on the site was the Glucksman Gallery, and that building tries to raise itself up to be at the datum of the cliff top of the university, but to create a kind of cavern or a courtyard or a hollowed out space beneath. And then the part that's raised up is enjoying its freedom in the trees, it's turning in the trees, it's looking up and down river. One of the most important parts of this project is the hollowed out core of the inside of the building. It's its structural core, but it has the effect that when you cross under the building, you can see up into it, and people inside, because there's no reflection on glass when it's unlit. The people inside can see clearly the people passing by. So you're at kind of midpoint in that section as you cross from the civic space of the university down towards the river. This building was designed 20 years ago, but it has this feeling of being ready somehow for something else to happen. It feels alert on its site, I think. And it has a grounded limestone, solid, profane kind of plinth, and then it has a celestial, dreamy boat in the trees. But the space we were trying to make, and the space we're continuing to try to make at the university, is the space in between, the space that creates a new public realm. Up in the galleries, you can look to the left, you can look to the right, you can, so to speak, almost step outside the building to find landmarks in the distance. And just to stand back and look at the building nowadays, and in the trees, the building begins to weather into the trees themselves. So we just more recently finished this little tiny single-span structure, and I thought we could show you that tonight. It's a continuation of what I was discussing with the Glucksman, because there's these looping paths that we're part of, and these diagonal views. So we didn't want to cross the bridge without tying those paths into another knot. So you've got to cross the bridge at a kind of skew. And that will connect the city, the north side of the city, better with the campus. But because the bridge has to be lifted above a floodplain level, because you might have once heard that the university is spectacularly flooded, including our brand new building. So the River Authority kept moving the bridge up higher, which meant we had to make a little leg to get onto it. And you see that made in concrete, and you see the timber bridge spanning. It's a 27-meter long single laminated beam structure landing on these flood-proof buttresses that allow the river in spate to run through. And at the landing end, it's a tipping down like a cantilever with two little moorhen's legs that dip into the water. From the top, from the university courtyard, you look down onto this wooden thing in the landscape. But from the pedestrian point of view, as you cross from the city, you now see up into a new prospect of the university itself on its cliff top. I mean, this university is built in the 1850s. It's built by the architect Dean of Dean and Woodward, who went on to build the Natural History Museum in Oxford. And what's so wonderful for us as architects to understand is that Dean not only built this university, but he chose the site for the university. All the client asked him was to find a place to build a university, and apparently he rode out of Cork on his horse and found a cliff. We are now building on the other side of his quadrangle, up against the oldest building in the college, the buildings from the early 1850s, which were the medical school and anatomical labs, which had to be kept separate from the main university for medical reasons. And that's now going to become a student hub, a kind of new center for student activity in the very center of the historic campus. But you can see that if this is the old building and this is our new arm that holds what we call a market hall, we've had to drill a hole through the historic fabric. We've had to open a big public archway through. And I'm just going to try to outline the principles of that project, which is currently on site and which is, if you like, our new baby. We're making a public space that works between the old quadrangle and what's called the Windle building, which you see here. The Windle was the first building built to Dean's design, and it was built in phases. First, this house, then oddly enough, this house, and then this house, and then two more buildings. And what we're doing, precariously maybe, under that chimney, is we're taking all of that away. And on the back, where time has added inappropriate extensions, we're taking all of those away. And inside the structure, we're trying to reveal as much of the grandeur of the Victorian structure as we can. And then in layers, on top of this unsuspecting, slumbering building, we're cutting a colossal hole through it. We're adding a curvilinear kind of seawall to it to hold in the hordes of students. And then we're adding a lantern at the top, which is for the student-facing facilities, and one great room for the college at the top. So, you know, it's a plugged-in, it's the part that the building didn't have, the part that the students need. And it has this, there's the cut, and there's the chimney, which is still there today. And there's the great window that will look out back to the university. And you can see that what we're trying to do is thread a kind of journey through this project for the students who are in their societies and in their student unions and in their meeting spaces. And then a whole lot of what we call market space for the unplanned activities that characterize student life. And that's, I just wanted to show you these couple of photos that we took last week of the building as the props come down and the concrete work of the market hall gets revealed. It's bridged across, and you can see the triangular roof lights that will come down from the roof gardens overhead. And it will be a big gathering space, a new kind of space within the old university. Up top, it has simple little collective facilities, administrative facilities for the students to run their own enterprise. And importantly for us, the new work has to sit together, knit together with the old, so that, because the new building will one day be old, and the old and the new have to belong to each other. So the stone mullions of the neo-Gothic architecture get carried out in the stone mullions of our contemporary extension. But if you keep your eye on the trees on the left of this beautifully landscaped, beautifully situated site, and just turn to face outwards across those trees to the stacked up city of what's called Sunday's Well on the opposite side of the river. We've just finished 2 houses, you can see them here, for professors, medical professors, who themselves would once have been trained in the building that we've just torn the bejesus out of. For some reason, they want to live opposite the university where they work. They are in a supervisory position on the other side of the river. And the retired doctor, professor parents live towards the rear of the site, and the current doctor, professor family live slightly pushed out. You can see how extreme the slope on the site is. Our biggest worry was not that this house would fall down, but that it would slide down. There's a lot of anchoring this way. But in our terms, it's a little tower house. And it has this prospect that from every part of the house, you look back towards the university to which they belong. And at the top of the house, the parents have a suite of rooms that between sleeping and sitting around. And at the bottom of the house, the children have playrooms and play spaces and sleeping accommodation, interconnected. And in the middle, the family meet for tea. So they join the landscape. They join the kind of stacked up landscape of houses that south-facing that have this splendid location in the marvelously luxuriant landscape of Cork that Sheila is going to tell you a bit more about.
So this small house was finished 20 years ago. So you can see that the tower houses have always been on our minds, and we've always been interested in the idea of a house as a tower, but also hill towns, which I suppose a lot of architects think about a lot. So maybe this is a very small house, just over 100 square meters, built in a small town in the middle of Ireland called Navan, and this is in the back garden behind a restaurant that the clients were running, and there was a level change on the site of 1 story. So we designed a 2-part house, and this is looking from the living room at the bedroom tower, which is a 3-story tower with 1 room on each floor, and the stairs up to the high garden. So it's designed as a living room on one side with a kind of cave-like roof opening across this courtyard and up past a little tower. And sometimes when you're designing, all the work you have is a small house, but you're pretending that it's a whole town and it's a hill town, and that's what keeps you going. And just around the time we finished that house in 1998, shortly after that, we were commissioned to do a project in Cork again, in the really steep part of Cork, for a girls' school called St. Angela's College, which is it's behind the wall on the right in that picture, the kind of reddish wall, which is a mixture of sandstone and brick. And in behind that wall is a girls' school, which is in a series of buildings. It's been there for about 120 years, a combination of historic buildings and sheds on this really steep hill. And we were commissioned, and you see the dates on the drawing, 1999 to 2016. I think it's probably our longest project ever. It took 17 years from initial commission to completing the building. But just before we look at that, if you look on the left, there's a very striking blue house on the same hill. And in behind that blue house is another school. It's a boys' school, Christian Brothers. And when we finished St. Angela's in 2016, the people who ran the Christian Brothers School thought they'd like one of those as well. So actually, probably it's the first time ever, they just rang us up and said, would you like to do a project for us also, directly across the road from St. Angela's? And we said, okay. So this project is for it's for a new set of buildings for science and a library and a canteen built on this amazing hill. Brick buildings with courtyards and landscape in front of the Blue House. And that's just going for planning at the moment. But back in St. Angela's, again, the Blue House is the landmark. Going right back into the west of Cork, looking across the city with the Blue House in the background. St. Angela's College is this collection of buildings here. This is the completed school. We made 3 new buildings, a science block, an arts block, which goes from 1 story down to 4, and a sports hall, which is under this ball court. And then we made significant additions and changes to the other buildings. One of the really striking things about the site, which is the area picked out in colour here, is although it is bounded by 3 parts of streets, there's only one place you can enter the building, and that's from this one point on St. Patrick's Hill, because that's the only place where the level inside the site matches the level of the street. So from the beginning, we knew that for construction and for the future life, that was the only way to get into the school. So our starting point was to analyse all of this, to take away all these temporary buildings and a not so great building here, and to keep these 3 historic buildings on the site. And then this really was a chance to make a hill town, because they needed a lot of new accommodation and the site was already quite full. And one of the principles we set out at the beginning in this very early sketch was that you should be able to move. There's an 18-metre level change from the top of the site to the bottom, which is an orchard here, down to a new space outside the sports hall here. And we had the idea that you should be able to move through the site without going indoors, through a series of courts and gardens and staircases, but that also you should be able to move through the school without going outdoors. So we were trying to make a kind of wrapped over inside-outside project. And we used lighter timber elements to make new staircases or to make a new walkway on this building on the opposite side of the project. And then seen from the south, looking up, you can really see the sense that it is like a sort of hill town piled up on the hill. And the ball court, which is surrounded by a big fence, so often you're there and you see these girls almost raised up in the air playing their ball games in front of the science block with the new buildings concealed behind the old here. So the site condition, as I said, was that it was a kind of enclosed site. And the biggest challenge was how to fit a big sports hall onto this site. So there was only one place it could go, which was at the bottom of the site here, by removing a lot of temporary buildings. So we sort of dug that in at the bottom and made new ground on its roof for the ball court, and then we built back from there up the site. So this is the one entrance from the public world into really the middle. It's the middle level in section and in plan. So you come in through the middle, through a path which brings you under an archway in the building to look out over the city, and below you is the sports hall, and above you the other buildings wrapping behind this old house. And the views to the city were really important. At those moments just before you go in the door, you can look out to the left and see the city here. And here are the new buildings making that series of outdoor spaces that you can move through, down through the site. And this diagram, in a way, explains the whole project. The top drawing is the existing buildings. The white ones are the ones we're keeping. This is a kind of new landscape we set on, with the entrance at the middle, a huge forum stairs, another set of stairs, and then a series of courts between old and new buildings which connect everything, and then buildings and landscape together, making our little Corkonian hill town. And where possible, we kept the gaps between buildings as narrow as possible, so as you go up the stairs, you really feel like you are in the old city and you're going under a bridge. And eventually you arrive at the very top of the site with this orchard garden, which the art room is the top room in the school, so it looks out this way into the orchard garden and that way over the city. And from the orchard, you look out past the science block with its extract hood for the fumes. And on the right is this art room, which looks like a single-story building, but if you keep moving down that building, it becomes 4 stories quite soon at the other end. And that art room has roof lights and views out. And the building is made of, it's a concrete frame structure with concrete block, and very solid timber windows with different kinds of opening lights, which give a kind of weight and warmth to the structure. And then the stairs from there moves down between old walls and new walls, right down past views of the city to the very bottom of the site where the concrete structure of the sports hall is, with highlight coming in with sunshine and views out to the city at high level, where they can now play full games of basketball. The only sport the school excelled at before was table tennis. So now they can do ball games. And then that space, that's used for drama also. So it's an outside performance space with the dining hall, and then this big flight of steps which connects the old buildings and the new, which you can see here in the elevation with the old building behind. And on the day of the opening of the school, the classic beginning of year school photo was 500 girls in green arrayed on these steps.
Sheila explained at the beginning why we called this lecture what we did. And I suppose those 2 chapters based in Cork are all about work that comes from the ground up because of the remarkable topography of that hilly city. And I'm going to talk now about projects that are worked their way up from the inside out as a kind of second aspect of that corollary. But as Sheila was telling you this story about losing the competition in Dublin, I thought differently about the title and realized that we had been ground up and turned inside out by the whole procedure. So this is Irish dancing. This is the Irish Language Culture Centre in Derry, and this is what passes for Irish dancing at a party nowadays. And they're upside down. But we were trying to make a kind of medieval courtyard. We were trying to make a negative space that felt like a tower had been pulled out of the space, because this site is so strongly characterized by being confined on all its sides. You cannot see out on any side except towards the street, and unfortunately on the street side there's an electricity power substation that can't be moved, so you can only get in a little bit from the street. So we started here in this project really to try to think about it as if it was born inside itself, as if it began on the inside, as if it didn't even know it was in town, and to try to pull the light down into the scheme and then to open the building up to itself, to its own inner life, because it's a multi-level, multi-layer culture centre. And the working out of the plan is that it's 55 meters deep, I think, and 15 meters wide, and everybody wants to get to the performance venue space that's deep at the back of the plan, and then they all have to escape out in a fire. And our courtyard that I'm talking about is here in the middle, and the immovable substation is here. So there's a lot of effort to get all the people in and out. So the zigzag structure that you see outlined in red is to try to bring some of that corkscrewed energy out eventually to the facade. But to stay with the inside, we were working on this courtyard, on trying to find a form for this courtyard, extracting it out, like a solid form. And we brought that piece, that kind of positive, negative, cast tooth space. We brought it to Venice for the 2008 Biennale. And you could come up to it and put your head into it, and it would play music at you, and it would run a daily cycle of light through the 24 hours day, a kind of digitally programmed laptop computer kind of music affair to anticipate the future vitality of an art center. And I think we're interested, to say that the things that architects do, which are not only build buildings, but the kind of things that you think about when you're thinking about building buildings, are also deeply part of the work. We don't want to make a difference between a sketch and an installation and a actually built building. I mean, I know they're different in practical terms, but in terms of what's going on inside your head, It's all the same. In the same way that time in your life is all happening now in your head. So in this case, we wanted this building to feel like it was its own ruin, and that when the elements of its attachments, necessary elements of staircases and bridges and walkways were attached, they would feel like they were clamped on to a kind of pre-existing form of the contemporary building itself. The building has its own history. And this was useful to us. I think this was useful to us when we came to deal with a much more complicated and much more extreme situation in Budapest, but with very similar confining site configurations. We're trying to squeeze the areas of overlap and areas of movement between the old and the new, and to look for kind of pocket spaces that can be found in those conditions. We hadn't been to Budapest before, and at the time that we visited, it had this opening up feeling of a city discovering its own character. And we were really interested to find that between the famous chain bridge and the basilica, that our university clients that we were working for were in this mixed up urban block, kind of right bang in the center of the old town, in the middle of a World Heritage Site. And one of Sheila's first sketches was to try to make the case for permeability, for the city and the university to become better integrated and introduced to each other, and that we could pull on the fact that it was so closely related towards the Danube, and that imagine, you could build a new building that faces right down onto the Danube. So when people are passing by on their music trips from Vienna, they can see the Central European University right in front of them. So a lot of this project started out, speaking from the inside out, a lot of this project started out with trying to take this tangle of 6th, 7th, 19th, very early 20th century, but mainly 19th century buildings, and open them up to each other through their party walls, and open them out to the city from street to street, from corner to block. And in one case, we were able to remove, in two cases, we were able to remove 1960s buildings that had been sort of dumbly filled in, and we were able to knock them down. And to speak back to the landscape of balconies and bridges and bay windows and cornices and the whole lively language of Budapest characteristics. The planning laws in Budapest have changed, and this site is regarded as a World Heritage Site, and there are no new buildings built within half a mile or so of this site. So making a new building in this situation was already a complicated and tricky business. But the planning laws have changed to say that you cannot have any more projections out onto the street. So a lot of new buildings now in Budapest are flat because they build to their building line and they're not allowed extend beyond. So that's illegal, if you like, and that would no longer allowed, and that's no longer allowed. So when we were in discussion with the planners, and because we had tried this before in Derry, we proposed the reverse, that we would sacrifice space to the street, and our room for our projections, if you like, would go inwards, not outwards. And so we developed this design and argued its way through the Monument Authority and the UNESCO projects and all the various planning restrictions. And having insisted that it would be made out of local stone and that its composition, which we anticipated would somehow suit the Budapest character, we finally fought our way through to the quarry, which is about 20 miles out of town, where every stone building in Budapest has been quarried since the time of the Romans. And we found, oddly enough, the quarry looked exactly like the building we were now proposing. It was as if our building had already been extracted from the quarry. And marvelous quarrymen came up and said, which part do you like best? And we picked this bit, and they took our photograph, and then they said, okay, this bit. And then the men moved the stone. I like the thickness of the stone because it has lots of holes in it, and if you use it really, really thick, then those holes are not a threat to its structure, but they communicate a kind of solidity, and those stones then have to be lifted. And then one day the building that we're building will look, like the building 150 years earlier that's across the street. And our new white stone building will one day, recognize and speak back to its neighbors. I guess we were trying to feel that the interiority, the containment of the streets in Budapest this building could wake itself up to be aware of that. And one of the pleasures of this project was working with the stonemasons and the craftsmen who could, we simply said there would be no mitered corners, no junctions like that. Every angle would be solid, and they understood that so well. So starting on the other side, from the inside, that was a detour to the quarry, but the buildings are all divided from each other by unbreakable firewalls, and we were asked to make, in the competition stage, we were asked to make a proposal to restructure this university, to give it a new configuration, and we proposed that there wasn't really any need for a new configuration. The configuration was already existing, and all that really needed to happen is it just needed to connect with itself. So we got to know or research or find out about so many sequential courtyard buildings in the city of Budapest. This one here is called the House of Seven Courts. That's what it looked like when we went there first. It's now Europe's party central. But in those days, it was quiet. And we made a kind of negative model, positive model of all the courtyards that were existing and all the courtyards that we were proposing, and proposed to the university that the big idea of their college would be represented by the social space of courtyards. And we had already, I think, drawn on this inspiration from Matta Clark when we were thinking about how to make the facades of the LSE. Matta Clark, you might know, attacked this Parisian block that was taken down for the construction of the Pompidou Centre, for the public space in front of the Pompidou Centre. But just before they took it down, he went at it with a conical intersect. And what strikes me so strongly about this, because Matta Clark was once an architect, at least as a student he was, but what strikes me so strongly is about the image of this, is that it says to us, at least, that the historical fabric can stand a little bit of excavation, and the contemporary thought can intersect with the given ground. So when we came to look at Budapest, we proposed that we could quarry out, we could hollow out the whole project from within, from treating the existing as solid, and then finding ways of, at upper levels or lower levels or coming right through the buildings. We could just find like tunneling ways of connecting the building to itself and to its new life, which in practice proved to be an amazing experience, a precarious experience. So the 5 buildings that were there, we tried to connect each one of them in a different way, to connect them at the high level, to connect them at the low level, to connect to the protected structure, to knock down the unprotected structure, to introduce new courtyards and to make it all kind of busy. And that means that you make some sudden and dramatic differences to buildings that have been lying asleep for a long time. And in order to make those courtyards active, we made them into temperate zones, kind of in-between zones, so the professors can sit in their offices taking fresh air from the courtyards. The students can gather in collective spaces inside in a conditioned environment, where the environment in Budapest changes from -20 in the winter to +40 in the summer. So we're kind of inventing a breathing machine to allow this building to reduce energy, and then to thread passageways and bridgeways through it, so that you explore within the historic fabric, you explore interstices. You cross bridges that sail over between teaching rooms and offices, and then those bridges cross voids between inside and outside. And then eventually you work your way to the top where there's a sumptuous roof garden spread across the top of old and new structures. And when we took this photograph, we were so enchanted by that we could see to the Hungarian Parliament, among the many magnificent skyline aspects of Budapest. What we hadn't been thinking about is the Hungarian Parliament could see us. So just to bring you on a short journey, thinking about Ellis's journeys. You start outside on the street, the building sets back from the street. You can see down into the auditorium. You can thread your way through this surrendered space under these piers and break your way into the collective space. So everything is made in, that's one block of stone. That's one block of stone. And it sort of peters out. But you see the auditorium, you see the entry. You walk into a volume between the old walls and the new walls. You find an elliptical concrete stair that corkscrews you up to the public cafe. And if you remember the red bridge crossing the historical refurbishment, then that red bridge ends in this red window that looks out into the courtyards of the new academic library. It can't cross because the library is silent. So it's more of a pier than a bridge, I suppose. But you see it in plan here where the bridges are crossing the space and arriving at this viewing point. And if you stand on that viewing point and look across, you see deep into the layers of the library opposite. And the library itself is organized around a top-lit courtyard, 6-story library with 500 students sitting in absolute silence. But I wanted, because they're all PhD students and master's students, and they don't talk to each other. But when we did our surveys with the students, we asked them where they'd like the student bar. And this is a campus for 2,000 students. And they said, bar? We came here to study. But what I love about this, and what I think is if I think maybe we invented one thing in the Glucksman, which is that hollowed out courtyard, this looks like a stairs to you, but what this stairs does by the way it's lined is that it means that the absolute silence, the pin drop silence of the library is open to the cafe outside with no door. So it's like entering through your ear hole. You enter through a twisted labyrinthine stairs and eventually go out to the cafe. And that is enough to keep up absolute acoustic isolation between spaces, which is interesting, I think. And then at the front, it overlaps itself, it overlooks itself, and eventually the students can see, like we wanted them to see, out to the Danube and the ships going by. So I mean, a lot of this project is invisible in a way photographically because it's about new and old and it's about overlap. But prominently visible is the facade and the relationship of the upper library and the lower auditorium and the public space to the streetscape space and the invitation that the building makes to the city to come on in, to enter, for the university to pour out to the city and for the city to flow into the university. And we thought we were making a calm, urbane, academic, welcoming building for a calm, urbane city until Orban abolished the university. Because he says now Hungary is an illiberal democracy and notions of liberality like academic freedom and topics like medieval studies and gender studies have no place in a university environment. So unless this rule is changed, this university has had a short life.
So this Canaletto painting, the Capriccio with Palladian buildings, is a painting we've looked at probably over the years. And I suppose, having talked earlier about losing competitions, it's a painting by Canaletto that imagines, collects a group of buildings designed by Palladio, some built, some not built, and makes a kind of new imaginary Venetian landscape from them. So on the right is the Basilica in Vicenza and the Palazzo Chiricati, but behind is Palladio's competition entry, unsuccessful, for the Rialto Bridge. And Canaletto has situated them all in time together as if they all did exist in this place. And we find we have a few times made installations in Venice at the Biennale, and this year again we were invited by Grafton Architects to make an installation in their free space Biennale. And in a way we were thinking about Canaletto and about the idea of a kind of capriccio, and also maybe about using an opportunity like this to get over the loss of a competition by giving it a different life, which would be its final life, but would be a kind of built life. So we had the idea that we would make an installation, which is a little building in its own right, but which brings together two projects, both, and the title is Folding Landscape East and West. And these two projects are very different in scale and in location. The first one is a competition for a grand opera house in Shanghai. And we had never been to China. We'd never thought much about working in China before we were invited to this competition. And then we just got very interested in the idea. First of all, it was a really, really big building. And for us just to design a building of 120,000 square meters with 3 big performance spaces seemed like a really interesting challenge. And then to try and think about how things stand at the moment in China and how we might make a contemporary piece of architecture in the context, on the one hand, of the modern skyline in Shanghai, which is probably very well known and particularly insistent on the idea of lit up buildings reflected in the river. But when we went to look at the city and look at the site, which is just outside the city, and the expo site, we also got interested in the old quarters of Shanghai and this beautiful painting of the Chinese Quarter, of this tradition of how cities were built with these amazing brick walls, again, on the edge of that river, and then these light structures on top looking out over the river and the landscape beyond. So we had the idea that in some way our project would be a combination of the sort of lit up bright spaces, but also thinking about the walls and the containment and the material quality of traditional Chinese architecture. So we designed what we called a city for opera, which is a collection of these 3 different performance spaces in a kind of walled enclosure, which is reflected in the river, and then which has 2 ways of moving through it publicly. On the ground floor, you can move through big porticos into an enormous set of foyers and open spaces, which we thought as being, as well as being like an opera house, a bit like a railway station. There were lots of other facilities, libraries, museums, cafes in the building. But we also wanted people to be able to walk over the roof of those foyer spaces, to have a landscape on the roof, and then to have the high forms of the opera house and the concert hall projecting into that roof space. The site, of course, was triangular, as at some periods in our life we seem to only ever have to work on triangular sites, so this one was. And we were working in plan and section, just thinking about a kind of triangulated structure with big concrete brick-clad piers and holding up these V-shaped concrete roof structures which stick down into the space, but which provide room on the roof for planting full-size trees by having this depth in the concrete. So we were making a kind of over and underworld, a world underneath with these bricks floored and walled spaces, and then you can see up through the high-level windows onto the roof garden, and then the canted concrete forms reflect the light into the space. And the 3 performance spaces are like 3 boats moored into the side of this river, the Huangpu. And then if you walk over the roof, you see the raised up light scoops which bring daylight and down into the foyer spaces with this viewing tower over the city. And then in the section of the building, this is the second, the smaller concert hall. And on the roof of that, we have an external performance space here, which is roofed as part of the garden. And then this is the second conference space. So if you look at that section, we brought that section and we built it into our installation in Venice at a scale of 1 to 10. And so all of the parts of the building are there and you can experience it, but it's 1 to 10. And the other project which we were weaving into the same installation is a much smaller project in the west of Ireland in Roundstone, Connemara, a research centre for the university in Galway, built at the end of this beautiful pier in the village of Roundstone, with the house which you see here as the starting point of the project. And the idea of our building was that that there would be a set of new buildings working with the old house on new platforms that brought you up around the house and out of the view over the sea. And the buildings made in concrete grow out of this little cliff, and the concrete has seashells and sea stones in it. And it makes a series of spaces which wrap around the old house, which is the house of Tim Robinson, who's a wonderful person who's sitting in the audience here tonight. And Tim and Mairead, his wife, have lived for more than 40 years in the west of Ireland. He went there as an Englishman, went to Ireland as an artist and mathematician, and then got interested in the landscape and in map making and in writing. So he has written wonderful, amazing books that have redescribed our own landscape back to us, and he's drawn these fantastic maps of the west of Ireland, which record everything and every little pier and the names of places. So they're a kind of historic record as well as a map. So when Tim left the house to the university in Galway, he asked us to think about what might happen to it. And we brought a group of students to make a map of the house which would have the level of information and intensity that his maps of the landscape have. So the students recorded the bedspread on their bed, the bird table at the end of the bed, the books on the shelves, which is a way for us of a kind of intense, close noticing about this place. And then we started working on the project, making sketches, thinking about how the new buildings would relate to the old. And then we went on holidays in the middle of this process and brought some stuff with us to think. And I made these sketches of stones we found on the Greek island, of different kinds of stone that are sculpted in different ways by nature. And sometimes it's hard to say exactly in what way these studies are part of the work that we do, but I know they are part of the work that we do, and you couldn't directly place them in the sequence of a design process, but thinking about form and light and nature is definitely a part of how we work. And we were working on this holiday place, so we started trying to make models using the things we had with us. So a pencil sharpener is a lift shaft, and a stone is a little stair tower, and a bunch of pencils represents a writer's studio. So we were trying to think three-dimensionally while we were away from the office. And then that comes back and is transformed into a design which is now at a stage where fundraising is happening. So this, unlike the competition, this is not built, but we hope it will be built. And we're making particularly this gathering space for exhibitions and for conversation in this beautiful location between the garden and the house of the Robinsons. And that we built at a scale of 1 to 2 as part of our installation on the western side of our little installation in the Corderia. And to transform those two projects into something else, which is a piece of architecture in its own right, we responded to the brief, which was to work with the Corderia building, to work with its existing materials, with the natural light, and with the windows which were opened up for the first time. So our proposal was to make a staircase which would bring you up so you could look out the windows of the Corderia out to Venice beyond. And this staircase, in a way, would be moving between the different scales of these two projects. And we made models and we studied it. But in a way, it's something else. It's also like a Greek chapel. It's a mountain chapel in Greek, a white painted structure brought down to the ground with steps and benches and thresholds, which allow you to stop and rest as you move in or out. And then you can move around it past Shanghai into a low-ceilinged exhibition space, roof-lit from above, like a little chapel, which has the drawings of the two projects and has a piece of gold leaf reflecting light onto a stone from the west of Ireland in a niche, which brings you back around to this arrival point with the bench and the seats, and then which gives people this opportunity to walk up and have a new experience of looking out a window in Venice.
So back to London. Our first building that we managed to build in London, our second attempt to build the same building, was to convert the warehouse structure in Soho for the Photographer's Gallery. And what had been so interesting about that project, and I think what we the thought that we tried to carry through in our transformation of the existing building, was the possibility of making something that operated vertically in an extremely squeezed condition of a laneway intersection at the back of Oxford Street. So in our original design for the project, we had tried to jolt the parts of the building apart in order to yield a bit of ground on the lower floor to widen the street, and then to create an overhang on the upper level as a quid pro quo for having surrendered something to the public territory to make larger galleries. And all of this was, I think, kind of stewing in our minds because we had made a site visit on the first day of this project to the roof of the existing building. And on that, this photograph was taken that day, and we saw at this crack in Oxford Street, and you can see up Tavistock Street, and on a fair day, you can see to Primrose Hill, maybe. But we were amazed that, Oxford Street is flat, completely flat. Ramillies Street is about 2 meters down from there, and the only access to it from there is through this funny little split it's as if something shifted in the city, and maybe a geological shift, and the city moved, and what we were proposing in our design was at the very moment that Oxford Street tectonically separated into its plates, the photographer's gallery sympathetically shifted. That was the context report in the planning submission. And, when we came back to the project after the project changed its character and the new building project was postponed or abandoned and the project became about reworking the existing, we just held on to this thought that, what about that view? So the whole project is trying to hold on to this idea that there's a way of seeing through the city from on high, like through a periscope. And then when you see the building from the city, that you're aware that somewhere up there are people, people interested in cameras, people interested in lenses, people interested in viewpoints, and people looking closely at photographs and at the image of the city skyline itself. So the solution to the transformation of the existing building was to stack it high and make this periscope, and also then to coat the historic fabric in a new camera case of insulated black material. And to working from the ground up of this, we took away all of the heavy base of the former warehouse to reveal its inner steel structure, and thus to, with a lot of hand-working terrazzo, to kind of reground the building in the public space, so that the street corner would have this aspiration to become a kind of Nighthawks at the diner place. What's so interesting to us now, when we go back, as we went back last week to visit, is that the neighborhood is being changed into a kind of outdoor photography gallery. So the dreams that you have about buildings coming out onto public space, they can come true. We wanted to speak a little bit about collaboration, and at the moment, and for the last few years, we have been collaborating with Alison Morrison, with Bob Alles of Alison Morrison and his colleagues, and with Arquitecturia from Girona, just north of Barcelona, on a major project in East London, now called East Bank. But when we started the project, which was a different brief and a different project, but the same site, it had the apparently unpronounceable Olympicopolis, which we had no sooner learned to say than it was gone. We're working, though, I think for us this is a hugely significant work in our life work, because we're working for the LLDC, the London Legacy Development Company Corporation, but we're working for them on an utterly civic-minded project, I think. The plan for the project is to create public space and public amenity, and to bring the city, the kind of urbanized city, to bring it right to the edge of the park, a beautifully utilized public park, which is part of the legacy of the London Olympics. But the first project, which you may have seen or heard of here in London, it was the basis that we worked out this idea of a kind of stepping stone of public spaces between public institutions and stacked up residential, which in the end would allow for the civic interest development of the site. And the project, I don't mean to say it was stopped, I suppose it was paused or restructured because of a number of things, changes to the brief, restrictions about heights of planning, revisions of intention. But the purpose of the project remains strong and remains true. And out of this work, Sheila and I have been commissioned to make 2 buildings. One for Sadler's Wells Dance Theatre, and another for a new museum for the V&A, which we're going to show you now. But before I do, I just want to talk about, you know, what's also in your mind and what doesn't leave your mind. So, you know, projects stop, but thoughts continue, or at least they turn. And in this case, you know, in the first iteration of our project for the V&A, we were trying to open the museum out because it had archive content in it, it had collections in it. It was a kind of open access interactive museum project on a very large scale. And we had found this tiny little box in the museum's collection, which is an incense smelling box. So we were trying to open the drawers of the museum and especially make the public space work deep into the center of the structure of the museum. So it's not so much that the building is cantilevered as much as that it has been hollowed out. It's been hollowed out to allow new pockets of public space. So I mean, this is typical or normal in an architect's life, that some projects get shelved, or some projects get delayed, or some projects get repurposed. And we're kind of happy, unhappy, if you know what I mean. That the most happy aspect of it is we are building a new museum for the V&A, and I'm going to show you that shortly. But when it is gone, it doesn't quite leave your mind. And speaking of collaboration, we also are in the habit of collaborating with others, not only with architects. And we have a long-standing collaboration with Joseph Walsh, who's a master craftsman who works in the south of Ireland but works all over the world. So I was talking to Joseph about this unfinished museum being hewn out of a solid block. So we said, why don't we do it? You know, why don't we actually try? So we got in a block of alabaster from some remote quarry in Italy, and one of Joseph's master craftsmen took out his chisel and started work on this big block of stone. I mean, this block of stone weighs 350 kilos or something. And working from our drawings, he just worked away at it, you know, to try to find the space, to try to cut out the public space, and to hollow out, to hew out the body of the unfinished museum. And I don't know what we're going to do with it. Nobody can lift it, and it's extremely interesting. And if you stand, you know, if you shine a light from behind it, because it's alabaster, it has this translucent solidity, which I'm sure will prove useful at some point in our lives. We didn't spend 2 years doing that, but we did spend some time doing that, and now I'm inflicting this on you. But I want to bring you back to the deep reality, to the practical reality, to the optimistic reality of what we're doing together with Alison Morrison and Architecturia at East Bank. Now, as Ellis said, now entering into the planning system. And it has this spectacular site because the park that lies between the stadium and the rivers of the channels of the River Lee is already itself a truly public space. And all we're trying to do is to bring the city forward to the park. And you know, this site has a kind of history. It has an industrial history. This is where the stadium is. These are the channels of the Lee. These are the train tracks still in place. This is the grain that crosses the site that we intend to keep. So, you know, for a long time, people have been sitting in trains looking out at this landscape. And not too many years away, 4 years away, this girl will see the new place that we are making together. And it's a jagged skyline. It's a Upper West Side, New York to Central Park urban composition between residential and institutional. And between the residential and the institutional aspects of it, Sheila and I have been studying 3 conditions. One for the Sadler's Wells Dance Theatre, one for a residential building as part of a complex of residential, and one in the center for the museum at the center of the scheme for the V&A. I'm working with Alison Morrison on the configuration of how to make a place, a kind of neighborhood out of mid-rise residential developments, but that would complement each other in some compositional way. We got to work on the building that's called the Prowl, which faces towards Hackney Wick and has a kind of terracing setback of a 3-story scale, like the Victorian mansion blocks, and that comes to ground in a civic way that sort of yields its ground at the river edge and makes a new point of introduction from the pedestrian contacts to Hackney Wick. And it's all planned around it's like a pencil in its configuration. You know, it ends up by the time it retracts to its form, it ends up like a hexagon in the sky with a central core and 6 apartments around the core, and every apartment dual aspect, and all the apartments looking out across this, because it's at this pivot point where 2 parks meet and the rivers diverge. A spectacular place, I imagine, to live. And it's this project, it's this residential quarter that allows this culture residential quarter to come into existence.
So I'm going to talk about the new theatre we're designing for Sadler's Wells, which is located on the F10 bridge, as it's called, the bridge that comes from Westfield over to the Olympic Park. And so Sadler's, the new theatre is here. The aquatic centre, which probably everybody knows, is here, so we're facing that. And this building then occupies a kind of 3-sided corner. It has 3 facades. And the bridge is at a level about 2 stories above the riverside below. So the site all the time is dealing with this 2-story level change. So the arrangement of the buildings, just seeing it simply in relation to the aquatic centre, is that the public always arrive at this level on foot. It's a pedestrian level, but it's where the public will enter the building. The road below is where the get-in and the backstage and the stage are. And then there's a set of terraces and studios which look out over the roof of the aquatic centre to the park beyond. And we're trying, I mean, it's a really interesting brief because it's not just a theatre for contemporary dance, but it also has 6 studios. So it's a kind of academy for choreography, but also for hip-hop. And it's a place where local groups and young people will be encouraged to come, as well as professional dancers. And then the dance theatre itself is a flexible space with a very big stage for 500 people. So we were trying to think what was the kind of form of this building, because interestingly, all these spaces are completely defined, not just in their area, but in their dimension and in their geometry. They are rectangular spaces. A dance studio is 12 by 14 and not any other size. So it's like a set of parts which you're then trying to put together and think how they relate to each other. So we started thinking about these diagrams that are made of choreographic diagrams about how people move their feet and the kind of rhythm of stepping. And we had the idea that somehow the building would have on the water side 3 of its studios with sawtooth roofs expressing themselves facing out this way, and then you turn the corner past the circulation and the other studio faced that way. So we're trying to get a kind of rhythm and movement into a building which is also responding very much to the industrial character of the past of this site. It's a brick building, it's using brick and clay in different ways, and also responding to Sadler's Wells' desire that this building really would be a kind of ready for work, robust, not in any way a kind of luxurious, elaborate building, that it should feel that anyone would feel comfortable coming in, and it feels welcoming and open. So we're trying to make this kind of language that has a strength. It's, I suppose, it's kind of an elaborated ordinariness that we're looking for. And the section shows you that relationship I described, that the public are arriving at this level, the foyer, and they come straight in one of the foyers down this very steep break to the theatre with a very high fly tower with one big studio on top of the audience, and then this terrace, which is a public terrace looking out over the aquatic centre. And the idea that we had is that the auditorium is in the kind of the northeast corner of the site here, which is where the road at the lower level gives get in. So it kind of holds a solid corner there. And then the foyer, which we think about more like a kind of living room, it wraps around two sides of that and has a very open expression onto the bridge and onto the waterfront. And then people come in, and all of the service elements like bars and toilets and back of house stuff is crusted onto the rectangular auditorium, which gives you then this sort of snaking space, which you come in one end and you move through and come out the other end in, we hope, a kind of lively space that keeps you moving. So the project as it has evolved is that you come in here, there's entrances to the auditorium, an interval bar, and the circulation kind of moderates the space into a set of different spaces with community dance in the corner, cafe and bar opening out in the southwest onto the terrace. And then as you move up the building, the studios are very simply laid out over the foyer with a double height space in the middle for socializing between the studios. And then at the very top, 3 studios face the water, a big studio faces the other way. So it's a very sort of geometrically organized plan and section expressing its use. We hope in a lively way that somehow people will feel what the building is for when they come into it, and they will feel this sense of its expression that relates to the past, but also is about itself. It's a contemporary building in brick. It's a building that lights up at night because it's very much a nighttime building. And then it works its way around from the more open corner to the view onto the F10 bridge, which is a kind of side elevation of the building where you see the circulation and the studios. And then around to the side where it's more solid, where the fly tower is and where the brick walls are containing the audience and the auditorium. And we were trying to think about how do we make a language of architecture which deals with the solidity and the lack of windows that there is required to be in this kind of building. So we were on a visit to Rome and looking at the Aurelian walls, which have this amazing, well, we realized they just have a series of fly towers at regular intervals along the Aurelian walls. We thought, okay, well, that's what you do. You take the brick, and where possible, you sculpt it or you shape it to do with responding to the functions that happen inside the building. So we started to think as much as we could in places where it needed to happen that we would set back at the corner entrance and corbel the brickwork back here. As a chimney that brings air down into the stage would corbel out at this point, at the wall that defines the stairs from the public realm below to above is a kind of crinkled brick wall. So what we're doing is developing a kind of language of brick and clay, all using the same clay, that there are tiles, studio roofs and walls are clad in big clay tiles. The brick walls, in places the bricks step out to give you a kind of shadowed articulation. The louvers are clay louvers made of the same clay. And then where the stage door is, this chimney that comes down and turns into a pitched roof. So we're working with the kind of expression and trying to actually make, I suppose, a positive of the fact that the building is a big brick solid. And then on the other side, facing out to the river, where it opens out, there's a canopy which gives you a sheltered space where you can have drinks outside, or people can collect after or before a show to discuss the show. And this canopy is made in concrete, as is the structure of the building. Very heavy concrete beams hold up the dance studios, which then come out to make this canopy through which light comes down to give you the sheltered space outside the cafe, or where the double height space is over on the way up to the studios. That gives us a terrace outside the studio overlooking the park and overlooking back into the foyer. So we're trying to work with this right-angled geometry to make a kind of world of heavy concrete and brick which expresses what's going on in this building and which at night is lit up to give a kind of life to this corner of the Stratford waterfront, now known as East Bank.
So I'm going to tell you about the building we're making at the middle of the scheme, the site here for the V&A, which is a building down at waterfront level, standing on Waterfront Square, but that also is connected to the podium level that Sheila was just discussing, where Sadler's Wells stands and where Alice and Morrison are designing studios for the BBC and a new college for the London College of Fashion in between. So we're making between us a kind of culture, education, public event spaces. But the V&A is an interesting public building in the context because every level of it is accessible to the public. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories of the building are for public enjoyment, and then those stories of the building open out to look across the river landscape, across the park, towards the structures, either from the Olympics or now the football stadium and the entertainment structure, the sculpture structure. So how to start to think about how to make a museum like this and a site like this, and where do thoughts begin? In our case, we went to see a magnificent exhibition at the National Gallery of Ireland of a collection of Vermeer paintings. The Irish National Gallery has one crucial Vermeer painting, but this exhibition had a number. And we were gazing, you know, with pride or possessiveness at the letter-writing woman and admiring her, you know, as you can't help to admire her. And Sheila said to me, we were just looking closely at it, and Sheila said, imagine living inside that sleeve. Wouldn't that be amazing? So I listen to what she talks about, and I tried to draw the space of the woman's sleeve. I just tried to think about it as a structure, as a place. And I mean, we weren't thinking about museums. I mean, we were just thinking about sleeves. But shortly after that, I went to see an extraordinary exhibition at the V&A of Balenciaga, of Balenciaga's fashion. I mean, you're going to think I'm interested in frocks here, but I'm not so much. But I was absolutely amazed by the form and rigor of the attitude that Balenciaga brought to how he brings a structure of a dress, of a frock, from the support of the shoulders down to the ground. And in the analysis of this exquisite exhibition at the V&A, the curators were discussing the Japanese concept of ma, the concept of the space in between, you know, the kind of pocket space between the figure and the final form. And yes, I guess this reminded us of Vermeer, but in the middle of the Balenciaga exhibition, they had a photograph taken by Nick Vasey, one of his X-ray photographs, of one of Balenciaga's ambitious frocks. And what the X-ray showed is that behind the form, behind the figurative form of what drops to the ground and gets cut away from the ground and hangs from the shoulder, that there's a lot of structure going on. And somehow this image, this kind of image of the the skirt and the structure and the life behind the structure helped us to imagine how to conceptualize the essentially interior conditions that are required for curatorial and object preservation that goes on in a museum. So the dark space, let's call it, inside the museum, the necessary structure that holds up the colossal loading of a museum structure, and then how to make sense out of all of that in its layers. So if that's a kind of very inside your head kind of way of thinking about it, it's interesting to look now just today at what the engineers are drawing, because they're also, so to speak, X-raying the structure, and this is the steel work and the concrete work that is necessary to hold these heavy weight, heavy loading floors up. And it's interesting to see how all the services that are necessary to provide the air and environmental stability, if you overlay that onto that and think of all of these systems that pass through the core and all of the services that distribute, it turns out that the X-ray concept is a crucial concept to understanding how this thing is organized. How it's organized is that trucks come in with the artworks from Carpenter's Road, and people enter from the waterfront square. So there's a kind of double aspect about how this building is approached. And then at the upper level, at the level that Sheila was just showing you, in the continuation of the public realm, there's an important entrance right into the middle of the museum. And a bridge, the Architecturia's pedestrian bridge is arriving across here from the International Office Quarter, and where the British Council will be. So this is a crossroads scheme, and it's a pivotal scheme at the crossroads point of the whole public realm of this new place. And we're trying to make it so that the inner core, the kind of base core stable environment of the museum is absolutely what it ought to be. And then there's a kind of crust around it. And in the crust around the core are found the pockets where the people can be in connection between internalized conditions and the outside world. Because we want the people in the museum to see the people on the square, and we want the people on the square to feel that they're invited in and part of the community of exchange between the museum and the public space. And you can see that these studies that we're making about movement through in those pocket spaces, and that those systems of movement, the maneuvering through the difference between the rigid core and the flowing cloak, will provide a journey for the visitors that will make sense between leaving the public space and arriving at the terrace that looks out over the long distance view. So can you see here how it's structured and how the spaces are kept calm, and then how the people are moving through the skin or through the cloak? And then when it gets its coat put on, it's a horizontally striated concrete skin, precast concrete skin in big pieces, and then those pieces have lines drawn on them to make them book page, off each other, so that one side belongs to the other, and then the scheme is cut to the ground, so that when you enter or when you come out from the cafe or look out from the galleries or stand on the terrace, that you're standing in relation to this formation. And one of the fascinating things, I just put this up to show you how intricate it becomes, is when you take all that surface and develop it out so that somebody can analyze how to fabricate it in high-tech prefabrication technology, that it resembles as much as anything else a pattern for a tailor's pattern, or a pattern for a jacket. You would make at home. Which brings me to a thought I had before I ever thought I would be making a museum for the V&A. And I was watching this film, I don't know, 20 years ago, that Wim Wenders made about Yohji Yamamoto. I think it was when we were first going to Tokyo. And there's this beautiful film, mixture between digital and film, that Wenders made about Yamamoto. It's called Notebooks on Cities and Clothes. And there's a great sequence in it where Yohji is down on the floor on his hunkers. People are passing him scissors, and he's cutting away at the dresses before they go out on the catwalk. You know, he's just making sure it's right. And you know, which is like what we work with cardboard models in the office like this all the time. And I wrote about this at the time when I was publishing First Thoughts, about this discussion between Wim Wenders and Yohji Yamamoto about identity. And Wenders told Yohji in this sequence in the movie that when he put on his first Yamamoto jacket and his first Yamamoto shirt, that he kind of felt different in them. He says they were new and old at the same time. In the mirror I saw me, of course. I can't do his German accent properly. Only better than me before. I had the strangest sensation. I was wearing, yes, I had no other words for it. I was wearing the shirt itself and the jacket itself. And in them I was myself, protected like a knight in armor. So I think we have this idea that the coat that clothes the V&A might become to the V&A the jacket itself, and that the public might feel by the prismatic structure of this scheme, the public might feel provoked and invited to come on in and explore what lies within, and then from within to celebrate the feeling of the prospect that lies beyond and ahead of them. That concludes our talk on From the Ground Up and From the Inside Out. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Could we have the house lights up so we can see people? Thank you. What a spectacular talk. We have about 8 minutes left, I think, till we get turfed out. So I'm kind of keen to really throw it straight open to the floor if there are questions. And can I see some hands? We have roaming mics both up at the upper level and down here. Am I being blind? There's one here. Oh, so wait for the mic, please. Sorry. Any other hands? Then one over there, okay.
Sorry if it's a bit of a personal question. I was just wondering, would you recommend working with your partner in mixing home and work life, in hindsight?
About what to do, but I think that for us, I mean, I made some reference to things that we do when we're on holidays, which are completely different work than the work we would be doing sitting at our laptops. We do not bring our laptops on holidays. So we find, for us, it works that because, you know, we're both walking up a mountain in Greece and we see a little chapel on a wall and, you know, we get completely distracted and diverted by that, and it's something that we share. So it becomes the life-work boundary is kind of blurred. But maybe architecture is that kind of profession anyway, where everything you do is experienced in a space or a place, so the nature of those places affects your life, and you think about things at the same time. So from that point of view, yeah, I think it works very well. It has worked for us.
Well, I don't know, we bought the couple's catalogue. We haven't had a chance to see the exhibition. We work together. I mean, we work in conversation. We haven't run out of conversation yet. I don't know.
As both educators and creators of educational spaces, what do you think is the biggest lesson for, well, future generations and specifically future architects? And how much do we build upon the old and how much do we create the new?
I think that for us, it just happened that the first public project that we made was the Irish Film Centre in Dublin, which was about 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago. And that was the transformation of a historic, in fact, a collection of 9 historic buildings, slightly different ages. So we were required, obviously, to completely get involved and embedded in the idea of thinking about the relationship between old and new. And we made this project which kind of weaves through the old buildings and restores them and has a conversation between new and old. And I think that because that was our first big project, that what we have found since then is that the way that we worked on that is the same way we work, even if the project is for a new building, because it's never, there's almost nowhere on the planet that's completely new, and most of our work is urban. So I think that we are really interested in the relationship between new and old. We're really interested in the idea that we're living in the continuous present, that there isn't really a difference between the new and the old, and that it's really important if you're making a new building that you are adding to an old building, that the new work doesn't embarrass the old building or make it look shabby. So I think we're not really interested in making something that's like a shiny contrast with the old. Somehow we think you should know what's old and new, but that there is a kind of sympathy between them, and that together they make one different transformed thing. I'm not sure if that was exactly your question, but...
Well, it was a question about old and... Wasn't it a question about old and new? I think it was. It was a question about education space, and maybe you're thinking about architectural education, but it's true that new things are only new for a short time, and they have a tendency to get old, if you're lucky. I mean, as an architect, if you're lucky. But it's important to remember that old things hold their newness too, and you have to approach, thinking from a point of view of architectural education, you have to approach an old building when you meet it with the understanding that it once was new itself and represents an idea, represents a thought, represents a kind of original force of its own, and that thought is embodied in that structure, and it belongs in that structure. So what architects do is they transfer the thoughts that are in their heads into the structures that are built and made, and the thought survives. So when we're talking about civic generosity, or I don't know what, the simple thoughts get transferred, and the structures radiate those thoughts. I think when you're making educational spaces, you've got to make spaces for people to overlap and meet and converse with each other. The real learning happens outside the classroom, and nowadays the real definition of discipline is at the crossing over points between disciplines. So, I mean, the reason we're showing you the conversations we have with a stonemason, or the creative relationship we have with a joiner, or the intellectual relationship we have with a painter, is because our idea of ourselves as architects becomes kind of clearer in the conversation with someone who's a painter or with someone who's a carver, maybe more clear than they are when we're talking to each other as architects. I know we're only talking to each other as architects, but we're very interested in extending the boundaries of the conversation about architecture into the public world. And I think in education buildings, the most interesting education buildings are the ones that open up the divisions between disciplines to make them friendly to each other.
It was a wonderful evening, and please, everybody, join me in wishing John and Sheila a very happy 30th birthday.
Thank you very much.